The day Cordelia Blackstone rolled up my gravel driveway in her spotless white Tesla was the day my piece finally ended. If you've ever seen someone who looks like they were custom-built to ruin lives in a board meeting, you can picture her perfectly. Platinum blonde bob so sharp it could slice glass, a $1,000 business suit tailored to command, and a clipboard held like a weapon. She stepped out in heels that didn't belong anywhere near mountain dirt, her perfume cutting through the clean air, jasmine and chemicals, like wealth pretending to be class. And with every click of those shoes, I could hear trouble coming. When she reached the porch, she didn't knock like a neighbor. She announced herself like a tax auditor. Cordelia Blackstone, president of the Pine Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. I already knew the name. Everyone did. Her signature was stamped on every letter, every notice of violation, every pointless rule that had turned our once quiet mountain community into her personal kingdom. I'd tried to stay clear of it all. My property sat on the far edge of Pine Ridge, 3 acres of old family land handed down from my grandfather, Miguel Rodriguez. He'd built this place long before the HOA ever existed. The cabin, the shed, and the spring-fed pond that had been running longer than Cordelia had been alive. That pond wasn't just water. It was legacy. It was the heartbeat of this land. And it was also where I scattered my wife Sarah's ashes. So when Cordelia waved that clipboard and said, "We have a serious problem with your unauthorized water structure," I felt the kind of quiet rage that doesn't show. It just sinks into your bones. She told me my pond was stealing water from the community. She accused me of hoarding a shared natural resource. Then she handed me the paper that made it official, a $50,000 lien against my property. Pay it or drain the pond within 30 days. It was like watching a stranger spit on my grandfather's grave. That pond had been there since 1962, carved by hand, stone by stone. Miguel built it as a natural flood barrier, channeling mountain runoff into a limestone basin to protect the entire valley. It wasn't stealing anything. It was saving everything below it from drowning. But Cordelia didn't care about history or science. She cared about control. When Sarah passed away, I came back to Pine Ridge. The city didn't make sense anymore. Too loud, too busy, too full of reminders. Here, surrounded by pines and water, I could still hear her laugh in the breeze. I could see her reflection in the pond's ripples. The locals called me Tank, a nickname that stuck from my 25 years designing flood systems with the Army Corps of Engineers. I'd seen cities drown, towns vanish, and concrete walls crumble under nature's fury. But this land had balance. Grandpa's design was perfect. It worked with nature, not against it. Until Cordelia came along, she called my pond an unauthorized water retention feature. I called it what it was, a piece of my family's soul. The HOA didn't care about souls. They cared about rules, rules Cordelia wrote herself, backed by her husband Bradley, a local councilman with a politician's grin and a spine made of air. While I was grieving Sarah, they held an emergency session to pass new water management ordinances. They claimed it was about conservation, but it was really about control. Every home was grandfathered in, except mine. That wasn't coincidence. That was a setup. For weeks I got letter after letter. HOA violations, warnings, photos taken from my fence line. They said my pond was dangerous, that it attracted wildlife, that it violated community aesthetic standards. Translation: Cordelia didn't like the fact that something existed outside her control, but this land wasn't part of her subdivision. It predated her. The HOA boundary line stopped hundreds of feet before my fence. I wasn't under her jurisdiction, but that didn't stop her from acting like I was. When I ignored her threats, she escalated. One morning I woke to tire tracks cutting across the field near my spillway. Later, I found fresh boot prints near the pond's edge, and one of my camera sensors blinking red. Someone had tried to disable it. That was when I realized Cordelia wasn't bluffing. She was building a case. Her plan was textbook HOA warfare. Harass, fine, overwhelm, and bleed the homeowner until they sell out. She wanted my land, or more precisely, the water rights beneath it. Rumor was that a new luxury development was in planning, and the only thing stopping her investors was my grandfather's pond, sitting right in the middle of their future expansion zone. So Cordelia decided to do what power-hungry people always do: rewrite reality to suit themselves. The next few days were quiet. Too quiet. The mail stopped coming. The phone stopped ringing. Even my few neighbors kept their distance, probably warned not to get involved. But I'd spent enough years in uniform to recognize the silence before an ambush. I started documenting everything. Photos, timestamps, letters, camera feeds, every knock on the door, every suspicious car that slowed by the property. I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused, and then the storm came. It started as a drizzle, soft and steady, the kind that soaks the ground before unleashing something worse. The air smelled like wet stone and pine needles. The sky turned steel gray. By nightfall, rain was hammering down so hard I could barely hear my own thoughts. Water poured off the hills, collecting in the runoff channels that fed the pond. The overflow system kicked in just like Grandpa designed it, a perfect balance between strength and surrender. But somewhere below, near the HOA's side of the valley, the drainage ditches began to back up, and that was when I saw them. 3 silhouettes, flashlights cutting through the rain, crawling along my fence line. Even through the downpour. My cameras caught everything: Cordelia's signature umbrella, 2 board members beside her, knee-deep in mud, and the unmistakable glint of tools in their hands. They weren't inspecting. They were tampering. At 2:17 a.m., one of my sensors flashed red. The water level had spiked. Someone had pried open the secondary drainage hatch, the one that regulated the overflow into the HOA's runoff system. They wanted to prove my pond was unsafe. They wanted it to flood, but physics doesn't play politics. When you block the natural path of water, it finds its own way. And by dawn, Pine Ridge Estates, Cordelia's pride and joy, was underwater. By the time the first light broke over the ridge, the storm had already swallowed the valley. The rain had eased, but the damage was done. Pine Ridge Estates looked less like a luxury community and more like the aftermath of a natural disaster. The drone footage from my security system told the full story. Cordelia's rows of manicured lawns had transformed into shallow ponds. Her precious brick walkways were hidden beneath brown, swirling water. The HOA clubhouse, her throne, stood half submerged, the American flag tangled in a gutter like a soaked rag. And me? I was standing exactly where I always stood, on solid ground, beside a pond that hadn't budged an inch, because my grandfather's system wasn't broken. The people who tried to break it were. When I walked down the hill to survey the mess, I saw the neighborhood in chaos. Residents were outside in rain boots and bathrobes, shouting across flooded driveways. Cars sat half underwater, headlights flickering weakly beneath the surface. The HOA maintenance crew trudged through knee-deep mud, their bright orange vests smeared brown, and at the center of it all stood Cordelia. Hair plastered to her forehead, her phone pressed against one ear, shouting into the void of bureaucracy she used to command. Even from a distance, I could see her frustration cracking through the mask. Her perfect world had collapsed overnight, literally, and while she was busy pointing fingers at the sky, my cameras quietly uploaded everything to the cloud. The footage of her and her accomplices tampering with my drainage valve during the storm. The timestamps. The sound of metal scraping stone. Evidence doesn't care how expensive your lawyer is. By noon, the county emergency crews had arrived, not because of the HOA's request, but because I'd filed a safety report at dawn. I told them water levels in the valley were unstable and that I suspected human interference. The officers took one look at my setup, solar-powered cameras, detailed data logs, decades-old engineering blueprints, and realized this wasn't some amateur operation. I showed them the footage. They didn't even finish watching before one of them muttered, "Jesus, that's her, isn't it?" Yes, that was her. Cordelia Blackstone, the queen of HOA order, knee-deep in a storm, literally undoing the one system that protected her neighborhood. By the next day, the headlines hit local news. Luxury HOA community flooded, residents demand answers. Reporters camped outside the gates. Drones buzzed overhead. Cordelia did what every power-drunk bureaucrat does when the spotlight turns on her. She panicked. First, she blamed me. She called me irresponsible, said I was harboring an illegal dam that had caused the flood. Then, when that didn't hold, she blamed the storm, the city, the county, anyone but herself. But physics doesn't bend to excuses. I sent the footage anonymously to one of the local news outlets. Within hours, it was everywhere. There she was, the HOA president herself, prying open my floodgate in the middle of a thunderstorm, ignoring the warning labels and camera lights blinking above her head. The internet tore her apart. Comments flooded in faster than the rain that wrecked her yard. Caught in 4K! She tried to frame him and framed herself instead. She's the reason Karens shouldn't have authority. Even the homeowners she ruled with fear began to turn on her. That week, while the investigation dragged on, I finally learned why Cordelia had been so obsessed with my pond. It wasn't about water hoarding, it was about real estate. A developer had approached the HOA months earlier with a lucrative proposal: expand Pine Ridge into the hillside. They'd build another row of high-end homes, complete with artificial lakes and golf course landscaping. The problem? My family's land sat directly in the path of their expansion. Cordelia needed to remove one obstacle, my grandfather's pond, so her developer friends could reroute the water and build their dream project. It was greed. Plain and simple. She just didn't expect her greed to drown her own neighborhood. The county inspectors returned within 48 hours, this time with environmental engineers in tow. They spent an entire day combing through the mud, collecting samples, measuring flow levels, and analyzing soil displacement. When they reached my property, they treated it like a museum exhibit. They studied the limestone walls my grandfather stacked by hand, the flow channels still operating perfectly despite the storm, and the spillway that carried the excess runoff safely downstream. Then they compared that to the HOA's new drainage ditches, the ones installed 6 months ago under Cordelia's orders. Improper slope, poor soil reinforcement, no sediment catch basins. In engineering terms, it was a disaster waiting to happen. The report would later read, unapproved modifications to the natural runoff path significantly contributed to water accumulation within the HOA. Boundaries. Translation. Cordelia did this to herself. When the HOA called an emergency board meeting the next evening, it wasn't to plan a fix. It was to save face. They gathered in the clubhouse, half the carpet still damp from floodwater, pretending everything was under control. Cordelia stood at the front, shoulders squared, makeup barely holding, trying to reclaim authority she no longer had. But she didn't know I was there, too. Not in person, but through a camera feed. See, long before any of this started, I had installed a discrete motion-activated camera inside that very room, hidden during a renovation I'd once helped Grandpa supervise. So when Cordelia opened the meeting, declaring herself a victim of vandalism and defamation, I recorded every second. The residents were no longer afraid. They interrupted her. They demanded proof. One of them held up a phone playing the viral footage of her breaking into my property. The room erupted into shouting. Cordelia's composure cracked. She yelled, accused, denied, then finally, when cornered, she made the mistake of threatening to sue the entire community for turning against their president. That was the final straw. Someone stood up, an older woman from down the street, and said, "You don't lead this community, Cordelia. You've destroyed it." The applause that followed wasn't loud. It was slow, deliberate, and final. Within days, the county suspended the HOA's operating authority pending investigation. Cordelia was stripped of her title and fined for environmental tampering and trespassing. Her husband's position on the council became a political scandal that forced him into early retirement. And the lien she'd placed on my property? Canceled. I received a letter from the county environmental division, apologizing for miscommunication. Official code for we caught the wrong person. Neighbors, who once avoided me now waved when they passed by. A few even came up the hill to see the pond, to ask about how it worked, to thank me for protecting the valley, even if none of them had realized it before. For the first time in months, Pine Ridge Estates was quiet. Too quiet, because I knew Cordelia Blackstone wasn't the kind of woman who disappeared quietly. It was just past midnight when I saw the motion alert flash across my screen again. Camera 4, the one facing the dam, 2 figures. Hoods up, moving low, not inspectors, not residents. Too deliberate, too careful. One of them carried something long and metallic, a crowbar. The other held a phone with a flashlight, scanning the base of the dam, and when the smaller one turned her head, the camera caught the face I expected but still hated to see. Cordelia. She was back. She wasn't done fighting. She wasn't trying to win. She was trying to destroy, because when a woman like that loses control, she doesn't admit defeat. She burned the boardroom down around her, but she forgot one thing. The dam she was about to attack wasn't just concrete and limestone. It was heritage, and it was built to withstand storms far worse than her. The rain started again that night. Not a storm this time, but a cold, steady drizzle that slicked the ground in silver. It was the kind of rain that whispered rather than roared, the kind that made the world feel smaller, quieter, dangerous. From my cabin window, I could see the faint reflection of the water rippling across the pond. Everything looked calm, almost peaceful. But years of working flood zones had taught me that quiet can hide chaos. When the motion sensor pinged on my monitor, I didn't even flinch. I'd been expecting it. Camera 4 lit up the screen. 2 figures moving along the edge of the dam, dark hooded raincoats, flashlights off, shadows against the night. I zoomed in. The smaller figure moved with sharp, deliberate precision, pausing now and then to give orders. Even through the grainy feed, I could recognize that posture, the stiff shoulders, the impatient flick of her hand. Cordelia Blackstone, the other one, taller, bulkier, followed her commands like a hired hand. He carried a crowbar, the metal glinting faintly in the reflected light of the pond. They crouched by the drainage gate, the same one she'd forced open during the storm weeks before. The same one that had started her downfall, only this time she wasn't looking for evidence. She was looking for revenge. Through the camera's microphone, the sound of scraping metal echoed faintly. She was trying to pry loose the lower gate hinges, the very ones that kept the overflow stable. If she succeeded, the next rain would send the entire slope downhill into chaos. I didn't move. Not yet. Every instinct in me screamed to go down there and to confront her, to stop her. But I knew better. Interfering now would only feed her narrative. She'd spin it, twist it, and I'd become the aggressor in her next report. No! This time, I would let the truth speak for itself, because what Cordelia didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that the dam she was attacking wasn't as fragile as she believed. Months earlier, after the first flood, I'd reinforced it, added a hidden secondary channel under the original limestone foundation. It redirected overflow safely away from the hillside, invisible to the untrained eye. She was fighting a ghost. The taller man struck the hinge again, sending a dull clang through the valley. Rainwater trickled around their boots. Cordelia gestured impatiently, shouting something over the drizzle. Then, for a moment, she froze. Her flashlight beam caught one of my cameras, the faint red blink reflecting in her eyes. I saw her face shift, recognition, then fury. She swung her light toward it and hissed something to her companion. He threw a rock. The screen flickered, but the feed stayed live. That was when I decided it was time. I picked up the radio and called the county dispatch, reporting unlawful trespassing and property sabotage in progress. The woman on the other end recognized my name immediately. After all, my footage had been the reason the last investigation went public. She promised a deputy would be there within minutes. While I waited, I kept watching. Cordelia was getting desperate now. She knelt by the base of the dam, using the crowbar herself, driving it between the stones like a knife. The rain had picked up just enough to turn the soil beneath her into slick clay. Her partner warned her. I could see it in his body language. but she ignored him. Power had always made her reckless. Then came the moment physics took over. The stone she was prying loose shifted. Water, trapped behind the loosened seal, burst through in a violent gush, splashing across her legs. She slipped, stumbling backward into the mud. The crowbar flew from her hands and vanished into the dark water. Her partner grabbed her arm, pulling her up just as the first siren wailed through the valley. When the deputies arrived, their spotlights cut through the rain like lightning. Cordelia and her accomplice froze, caught mid-motion, soaked, muddy, and unmistakably guilty. They tried to spin it. They always do. Cordelia claimed she was inspecting damages and that I had lured her here. But the deputies weren't buying it. I walked down the hill with my floodlight in hand, the rain dripping from my hat, my boots sinking into the wet ground. Cordelia's eyes met mine across the beam of light. For a brief second, the mask slipped. There was no arrogance left, only raw, venomous hate. She looked like someone who'd lost everything and was desperate to find someone to blame. The deputies escorted them both up the slope. One of them paused to ask if I wanted to press charges. I didn't answer right away. Looking at Cordelia, shaking and furious, I realized she'd already punished herself more than I ever could. Her reputation was gone. Her marriage, her power, her illusion of control, all washed away by the very water she'd tried to conquer. I told the officer, "Just make sure she doesn't come back." By sunrise, the story had spread again. Another viral storm. HOA president caught tampering with private dam again. This time, it wasn't just local news. National outlets picked it up. Late-night shows joked about it. The internet called it the Karen Flood Part 2. And Cordelia? She vanished. Her husband resigned from his council seat, citing personal stress. Her house went on the market within a month, the listing price dropping every week until it finally sold to a young family who probably had no idea whose ghost still haunted that address. The HOA dissolved completely. The residents voted to turn it into a voluntary neighborhood association with no president, no fines, no petty politics, just neighbors helping neighbors. It took losing everything to remind them how to live like people again. A few weeks later, the last of the cleanup crews packed up and left. The rain had stopped for good this time, replaced by clear skies and the gentle rhythm of a mountain spring. I spent the morning by the pond, checking the flow valves and tightening the spillway gates. Everything worked perfectly, as it always had. The reflection of the pines shimmered across the water, golden with dawn. For the first time in months, I felt peace again. That was when I saw it, something half buried in the mud near the dam. I knelt and brushed it off. The metal glinted in the light. The crowbar. Rusting, heavy, forgotten. Cordelia's last attempt to control something she never understood. I planted it upright beside the dam, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. A monument to arrogance. Sometimes when I sit by that water, I think about how close it came to destruction. Not because of nature, but because of people. My grandfather always said, "Water remembers." I didn't understand it as a kid, but I do now. Water remembers where it's meant to go. It remembers every stone, every path, every careless hand that tries to change its course. And when people like Cordelia try to bend it to their will, it doesn't fight back in anger. It simply waits. It waits for the moment when pride gives way to gravity. That night, as the crickets sang and the air cooled over the hills, I shut off the monitors for the first time in months. No more watching, no more waiting. The cameras had seen enough. So had I. Because some stories don't need a final confrontation. Sometimes the best revenge is letting the truth stand quietly and letting nature finish the conversation. For the first time in years, Pine Ridge Estates was quiet. Not peaceful, not yet, but quiet in that hollow way a place gets after a storm passes and everyone is still trying to understand what's left standing. The HOA office, once a hub of weekly meetings and endless memos, sat empty. The blinds were drawn. The fancy HOA logo plaque on the wall had been taken down. The nameplate that once read, Cordelia Blackstone, President, lay cracked on the floor, trampled in the mud during one of the final inspections. A faint smell of mold lingered in the air, mixed with damp carpet and paper rot, the perfume of bureaucracy decaying. Cordelia was gone. The board members resigned one by one, each citing stress, legal uncertainty, or family relocation. What they really meant was fear. Fear of being dragged into lawsuits, or worse, the internet's endless memory, because the story hadn't gone away. It had grown. Every major outlet had picked it up. The HOA president who flooded her own neighborhood. Caught on camera, sabotage in the suburbs, water rights, revenge, and a $50,000 lien gone wrong. They turned it into a parable, a cautionary tale about greed and control. Cordelia Blackstone became the face of what happens when petty power goes too far. I didn't need revenge anymore. The world had handled that part for me. For weeks, I worked on restoring the land. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. The pond had held strong, but the flood had carved deep scars through the valley below. I helped the county crew reinforce the culverts and stabilize the soil near the lower slopes. I donated extra limestone from my grandfather's old quarry pile to rebuild the retaining wall that had collapsed behind one of the homes. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now came up the hill to talk, to thank me, to ask for advice about how to prevent future damage. Funny how disaster makes people human again. They brought food, tools, even coffee, gestures that, a few months earlier, would have been unthinkable. Some apologized for not believing me, for assuming Cordelia's lies were truth. I told them it didn't matter. What mattered was that the land was healing, and so were they. The county's formal review took place a month later. I didn't plan to attend, but curiosity got the better of me. The small courthouse room was packed. Homeowners, lawyers, a few reporters. Cordelia wasn't there. Her attorney claimed she was unwell, though rumor had it she'd left the state entirely. The county commissioner went through the findings methodically. They'd confirmed unauthorized tampering with a registered water control structure, falsified HOA reports, and violation of environmental safety codes. When he read aloud the line, "The defendant's interference directly contributed to the flooding event of Pine Ridge Estates," the room was silent. Then came the part that mattered to me. The $50,000 lien was officially voided, all penalties removed, and, in a twist of irony, the county ordered that my pond, once called unauthorized, be designated as a protected watershed landmark. I couldn't help but smile. My grandfather would have been proud. The same water Cordelia tried to destroy would now be legally untouchable, safeguarded by the very government she'd weaponized against me. 2 weeks later, I drove past her old house for the first time since the flood. The manicured lawn was gone. The hedges had wilted. A for sale sign leaned crooked in the mud, its letters faded from the sun. The once perfect home looked tired, stripped of its arrogance, just wood, glass, and regret. Rumor around town was that her husband, Bradley, had quietly settled multiple lawsuits. His political career evaporated overnight. The city council cut ties, the donors pulled funding, and their family name became a punchline. Sometimes justice doesn't come with handcuffs. Sometimes it comes with silence, isolation, and the loss of everything you thought made you powerful. By summer, Pine Ridge had changed. The HOA was officially disbanded. The residents voted to form a simple neighborhood association, voluntary, transparent, and led by a rotating committee. No fines, no threats, no power games. Just community. They asked me to join the first committee. I politely declined. I told them I'd be there if they ever needed engineering help, but I'd had enough of meetings and rules to last me 2 lifetimes. Instead, I helped them rebuild the drainage layout. Together, we restored the old natural water channels that Cordelia had blocked off. We planted reeds and native grasses to help control erosion. The land began to heal faster than anyone expected. It was poetic in a way, the very thing Cordelia had feared. Nature taking back control was what saved them all in the end. One evening, Just as the sun dipped below the ridge, I heard the sound of tires crunching on gravel. A silver pickup pulled into my driveway, one I didn't recognize. A man stepped out, mid-40s maybe, wearing a weathered work jacket. He introduced himself as Eli, one of the new homeowners who had bought Cordelia's old property. He smiled nervously and said, "I just wanted to say, thank you. That pond down there, it's beautiful." I heard what happened. I nodded. We stood there a moment, the pond glimmering in the distance. He told me his daughter liked to sit by the water and watch the frogs, that it made her feel calm. When he left, I looked down at the pond and realized the cycle had come full circle. Cordelia had wanted to erase something sacred, and now it had become part of another family's peace. That's how nature works. It doesn't hate, it just reclaims, reshapes, and forgives. A few weeks later, one of the neighbors, an older woman named Diane, who'd lived here since before the HOA, came by with something wrapped in a towel. When I unwrapped it, I found a small bronze plaque. The engraving read, "Rodriguez Pond, established 1962, protected by nature. Preserved by honor." I installed it by the stone steps leading to the water. The metal gleamed under the afternoon sun, and for the first time since Sarah died, I felt something close to peace. The sound of the trickling spring, the smell of wet pine. It all felt alive again. The pond wasn't just a piece of family history anymore. It was a symbol of survival. A month later, I received an envelope in the mail. No return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable, sharp, slanted, and angry. Inside was a single piece of paper. No apology, no explanation. Just 6 words written in neat black ink. "You didn't win. You just waited." I stared at the page for a while, then folded it carefully and set it in the fireplace. Maybe she was right. Maybe I hadn't won. Maybe there were no winners in wars like this. But as the paper curled and turned to ash, I realized something else. Waiting was all I ever needed to do, because power fades. Money dries up, but nature always endures. These days, when it rains, I sit on the porch with a cup of coffee and watch the... By the start of fall, Pine Ridge Estates looked almost new again. Not the artificial perfection Cordelia once forced on everyone, but something better. Something honest. The grass grew in uneven patches. The wildflowers had come back on their own, painting the slopes with gold and violet. The air smelled of pine sap and rain-soaked earth, and at night the sound of crickets carried all the way down to the valley floor. It was strange how quiet peace could be. After months of chaos, the absence of noise felt foreign. No HOA announcements, no late-night emails, no threats or legal letters. Just wind and water, whispering the same steady rhythm that had always been here. Sometimes I'd catch myself expecting to see Cordelia's white Tesla creeping up the road again, but it never came. The HOA was gone, its office repurposed into a small community shed for tools and local gardening projects. The same building that once hosted endless meetings now echoed with laughter and children's footsteps. It felt right. One morning, a county environmental officer named Harris stopped by unannounced. He'd been part of the original investigation months earlier and wanted to finalize documentation for the Rodriguez Pond Preservation Zone. I took him down to the water. The air was cool and crisp, the surface glass smooth except for the soft ripples from the spring's trickle. He walked the perimeter slowly, taking notes, measuring water flow, photographing the limestone channels my grandfather built. Then he said something I'll never forget. "Mr. Rodriguez, your grandfather's design. It's perfect. 50, 60 years old, and it's more efficient than half the modern systems I see today. Whoever built this understood nature better than most engineers ever will." I smiled. "He always said the land teaches you if you listen long enough." He nodded, scribbling that onto his clipboard. Before leaving, he turned to me and said, "You know, it's poetic. The very thing that HOA tried to destroy is now protected by law. Cordelia's policies didn't survive the storm, but this pond did." That stayed with me. Cordelia had spent years writing bylaws, rules, and restrictions, all erased by a single flood. And yet, one man's work with stone and patience had outlasted every one of them. Later that week, I found myself in my grandfather's old workshop, a small, dust-covered shed filled with tools, ledgers, and the smell of machine oil and pine wood. On one of the shelves sat an old journal, its leather cover cracked with age. Inside were pages of notes, sketches, and numbers, flow diagrams, hand-drawn maps of the pond. And at the bottom of one page, written in his neat, looping handwriting, was a line that made my chest tighten. Build for balance, not control. The land will remember who listens. That was Miguel Rodriguez in a sentence, a man who believed you don't own nature. You cooperate with it. Cordelia had done the opposite. She tried to own, dictate, reshape, and nature responded in kind. As I read through those pages, I realized something else. This land wasn't just my inheritance. It was a legacy of understanding, a conversation passed down through generations. And for the first time since Sarah died, I felt like I still belonged to something bigger than myself. A few days later, another envelope arrived. This time, it wasn't anonymous or hostile. It was from the county clerk's office. Inside was an official notice, effective immediately. The property known as Rodriguez Pond has been recognized as a local heritage landmark for its environmental and historical value. That title came with something symbolic: protection. No one could touch it now. No development, no HOA, no future ordinance. I stared at the document for a long while. All those months of frustration, loss, and anger finally distilled into one piece of paper that said what I already knew. This land was rightfully ours. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about closure. That weekend, the residents of Pine Ridge held a small gathering at the park. Nothing official. No speeches, no formalities, just a quiet celebration of survival. They set up folding tables, brought homemade food, and even kids from nearby towns came to play near the creek. Someone started a fire pit. Someone else brought music. For the first time in decades, this community wasn't ruled by fear. It was guided by gratitude. I didn't stand out or say much. I just sat near the edge of the group, watching people laugh in the same place where months earlier they'd argued and filed complaints. Diane, the older neighbor who'd brought me the plaque, walked up beside me. She held a paper cup of cider and said softly, "You know, Marcus, this place feels lighter now. Like it can breathe again." I nodded. The land always breathes when people stop choking it with rules. She smiled and patted my arm. "Well, you reminded us of that." As winter approached, the days grew shorter and the air colder. The pond froze in thin sheets of glass. I started building a small bench on the hill overlooking the water. Nothing fancy. Just wood and stone, the kind of place Sarah would have loved to sit. When I finished, I carved a small inscription into the side. It wasn't for me or Cordelia or the HOA. It was for Sarah and Grandpa. Patience is nature's justice. Every time it rains now, I sit there and watch the ripples. The sound isn't anger anymore. It's peace. Sometimes, when the mist rises over the pond in the early morning, I imagine the spirits of those who came before, my grandfather, Sarah, standing beside me. It doesn't hurt as much anymore. It feels like they're proud. One morning, I was fixing the outer fence when I noticed a car slowing near the bottom of the drive. It wasn't familiar. A modest gray sedan, not the flashy white Tesla that once symbolized arrogance. A woman stepped out. Late 40s, dark hair pulled back, no makeup, just a plain gray coat. For a moment, I didn't recognize her. Then I saw the eyes. Cordelia. She looked smaller somehow, not in stature, but in spirit. No clipboard, no posture of authority. Just a tired woman carrying something heavy she couldn't drop. She didn't walk all the way up. She stopped halfway, near the old oak tree, and just looked at the pond. I didn't move toward her. I didn't speak. I just watched from a distance. After a minute, she turned and walked back to her car. Before leaving, she placed a small envelope on the fence post. When I finally opened it later that afternoon, there was no note, no words, just a photograph. It was of the pond, taken years ago before all of this. Before the flood, before the fights. The water clear, the trees full, sunlight spilling over the ridge. On the back, in faint pencil, 2 words. You were right. That was the last I ever heard from her. I didn't frame the photo or throw it away. I tucked it into my grandfather's old journal, not as a trophy, but as part of the story. Because forgiveness isn't about forgetting what someone did. It's about refusing to let it live rent-free in your heart. Cordelia had lost everything chasing power. I had nearly lost myself trying to defend peace. Now maybe we were both learning the same lesson, that nature has its own justice, one that doesn't need courts or crowds or cameras, it just needs time. That night, as I stood by the pond under a silver moon, I realized how quiet the world had become. The frogs croaked softly, the water moved lazily through the spillway, and the stars shimmered across the surface. The war was over. Not won, not lost. Just over, and in the end, that's all I ever wanted. Winter settled over Pine Ridge like a soft exhale. Frost crowned the pines. The air was sharp enough to taste, and the world moved slower, as if even the land needed time to rest after everything it had endured. From my porch, I could see the pond half frozen under the pale light of dawn. The surface glimmered with a thin layer of ice, broken in places by gentle swirls where the spring water still pulsed through. The sound of it, that faint trickle under the cold, was comforting, constant, eternal. It had been nearly a year since the flood that destroyed Cordelia's kingdom, and the valley had healed in ways I couldn't have imagined. The residents had rebuilt their homes, their gardens, their trust. But they did it differently this time. Slower, humbler, without the arrogance that once smothered every blade of grass. The HOA was nothing more than a name in old documents now. No one mentioned it anymore. It was like it had never existed. And yet, whenever the wind carried the smell of wet soil up the ridge, I still remembered how fragile everything had felt, how close I'd come to losing not just my land, but the last piece of Sarah and my grandfather that still remained. The first real snow came late that year. Heavy, slow flakes that drifted like falling feathers, blanketing the world in silence. I walked down to the pond with a shovel in one hand and coffee in the other. The ground crunched beneath my boots, and my breath came out in clouds. The water was still flowing, even under the ice, the natural spring doing its work, quiet and steady. I brushed snow from the plaque Diane had given me. Rodriguez Pond, established 1962, protected by nature, preserved by honor. Those words glowed faintly beneath the frost, and I realized something. I wasn't just maintaining the pond anymore. I was keeping a promise, not to the HOA, not to the law, to my family, to Sarah and to Miguel, that I'd never let this place be forgotten. I set up a small wooden bench beside the water, replacing the old one I'd built that summer. This one was sturdier, carved with new initials. Not just mine, but also my grandfather's. When I finished, I sat there until my coffee went cold, watching the mist rise off the surface, and for a moment, I swore I could hear Sarah's laugh carried in the wind, soft and familiar, blending with the sound of the stream below. A few weeks later, Officer Harris returned, the same environmental officer who had helped designate the pond as a heritage site. He arrived unannounced again, his boots crunching through the snow as he waved from the gate. "Thought I'd check in," he said, shaking the cold from his coat. "County's been showing your pond to visiting students from the university. Civil engineering majors. They're studying your grandfather's design." I blinked. "They're studying it?" He smiled. "Apparently it's a textbook example of sustainable water control. You're famous, Marcus, or at least your family is." I couldn't help but laugh at that. Grandpa Miguel would have found it funny, too, that his humble, hand-stacked stones were now teaching the next generation what arrogance had made everyone forget. Before Harris left, he added, "You know, most people think progress means concrete and machinery. But sometimes the best engineering is just listening to the earth." I nodded. "That's all Grandpa ever did." When he drove off, the sound of his truck faded quickly, swallowed by the snow. I stood there a while longer, watching the pond shimmer under the pale winter light. Even now, a year later, I still caught whispers about Cordelia Blackstone. Some said she'd moved to Arizona. Others claimed she'd joined a developer firm in another state under a different name. A few believed she was trying to rebuild her reputation online, reinventing herself as some sort of real estate consultant. I never looked her up. I didn't need to, because Cordelia had already left her final message. That photograph of the pond, with the words, "You were right," written on the back. Every so often, I'd take out my grandfather's journal and find the picture tucked between the pages. It reminded me that even the proudest people eventually hear nature's lesson. Some just hear it too late. When spring came again, Pine Ridge transformed once more. The snow melted, feeding the streams and filling the pond to its brim. Wildflowers bloomed across the banks, the air thick with the scent of pine and fresh water. I spent most mornings down by the dam, checking the gates, patching small cracks, and adjusting flow levels just as my grandfather had taught me. One morning, a group of school children arrived with their teacher, part of a local environmental project. They watched the water flow through the spillway, listened as the teacher explained how the system worked, how it saved the valley from floods. One of the kids, a little girl with curly hair, asked, "Who built it?" The teacher smiled and pointed toward me. "His grandfather did." The girl turned, her eyes wide. "So he's taking care of it now?" I nodded. "Just keeping it alive." She grinned and said, "That's cool. My grandpa teaches me to fix things too." That small moment, that innocent connection, felt like everything had come full circle. The pond wasn't just water and stone anymore. It was legacy passed on, lesson preserved. That summer, a storm rolled through the mountains, the kind that used to make the whole valley nervous. Sheets of rain hammered the rooftops, lightning flashed through the clouds, and thunder rolled for hours, but this time, no one panicked. The pond handled it perfectly. The spillway carried the overflow into the channels, which flowed smoothly through the valley, right where they were meant to go. From my porch, I watched as the rain washed over the land like cleansing breath. No floods, no destruction, just balance. When it ended, the sky cracked open into a brilliant gold sunset. The water sparkled. The air felt brand new. That was the moment I realized nature had spoken louder than any rule book ever could. It didn't need permission or policy or power. It simply needed to be left alone. Years from now, maybe no one will remember Cordelia's name. Maybe the HOA's old bylaws will gather dust in some archive, unread and irrelevant. But this pond will still be here. And maybe another man, or woman, will sit on this same bench, hear the same wind through the pines, and understand what I did, that power doesn't mean ownership. It means stewardship. It means knowing when to step back and let things be. On the anniversary of Sarah's passing, I took a bouquet of mountain lilies down to the pond, her favorite. The air was still, the sky washed in soft lavender. I placed the flowers at the edge of the water where her ashes rested and whispered quietly, "It's safe now." The breeze shifted. A ripple moved across the pond, gentle and precise, as if answering me. I sat there for a while, just listening. The frogs croaked softly. The spring murmured below. The smell of pine wrapped around me like a memory, and in that moment, I realized I wasn't alone. Not anymore. Sarah was here. Grandpa was here. And the land, our land, remembered everything. If you ever drive through Pine Ridge now, you'll see the sign at the entrance, not Pine Ridge Estates anymore, just Pine Ridge. No mention of homeowners, no mention of regulations. Just a community built on respect for what's real. Sometimes the locals will tell new families about the flood that changed everything. They'll talk about the man on the hill who refused to drain his pond, the one who chose patience over revenge and faith over fear. And when they do, I hope they understand one thing. The pond didn't just save the valley. It saved us from ourselves, because when greed tries to own nature, nature doesn't retaliate. It simply waits, and then, when the time is right, it reminds us who's in charge.